Okay. So we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Emily Rapport. I run ePaint Studio, which is my studio as well as a gallery in Chicago. Our current show is called Inscapes, and we have 3 artists on exhibit there. We have with us Claire Elliott, who is in Portland, Vanessa Shinmoto in Chicago, and also Alexandra Stevenson in Chicago. So what we're gonna do is share some videos that each of the artists have created about their process. Each video is about 5 minutes. So we're gonna start with Alex. Is that all right? Okay. So 1 second, I gotta switch screens. Oops.
Wax medium, a cold wax medium. I use door lens and oil paint. And these are a few of the techniques that I used for the paintings that are in Inscapes. So wax.
Emily, I think the audio is off. Do you want me to,
Sorry, that's my fault. Duh. Okay, let's try that again. Take 2.
It's like any medium.
All right.
Things with wax medium, a cold wax medium. I use door lens and oil paint. And these are a few of the techniques that I used for the paintings that are in Inscapes. So wax medium is like any medium. It mixes with the oil paint to change the translucency and the texture. And this is beeswax with a little bit of resin. Lots of different companies make it. And I've got it on my palette here. What I do to start with is use quite a bit of the wax in order to get some translucent layers. So if I'm using a blob of wax about the size of a dime, I'm gonna start with just a little bit of paint, maybe about the same amount, mix it up. It will change the gloss of the paint to a much more matte finish, matte texture. And when it dries, it's sort of a matte, satiny texture. And then I do apply it with a palette knife. And what I found in terms of spreading it is that while you can use a brush, certainly, so if I use a brush, I can create some brush strokes or scratch through. Really, the best way to spread it has been to use some paint scrapers and sort of push it into the weave of the paper. And it will pick up whatever weave is on the paper. This doesn't have much of a weave, it's a canvas paper, but you can sort of see probably if I bring it up close how it picks that up. I like to start with thin layers. My favorite tool to use, actually I'll show you in one moment here, I'm just going to add some blue. My favorite tool is actually a kitchen tool. I'm going to add a little bit of this blue, and then I'm going to use a silicone bowl scraper that I truly ordered online from a kitchen supply store, and use that to start spreading. And you can see how it can make quite a thin layer or even a thicker layer depending on what you're interested in. So that's usually my starting point, is putting on those thin layers. What I love about this silicone tool is that it is also great at creating lines and removing. So as you can see, if I go through and just sort of scrape it or move it a bit, it will create those lighter, more transparent lines. So I continued to add a few more layers. My colors got a bit murky, and I obliterated the drawing that was underneath here, which is fine with me. Sometimes I stick with the drawing that I start off with, and oftentimes I don't. I let it disappear and discover something new. But these lines here were made just as I was showing you a moment ago with the spatula. Another way to remove the paint, which I find is just as much part of my process as adding paint, is taking a brush and some turpentine. A lot of the skies a couple of the skies at the Inscape exhibit that I have were done with this, where I'm really just going back in and loosening paint and creating textures. I use all sorts of different tools, sometimes to scratch. This is a broken chopstick. I'm afraid because my colors are murky, it's probably hard for you to see what's scratching through, but I think you can get the idea. And then of course, even just taking a paper towel or a rag and going into and rubbing and lifting up, which is what I would do in the case of this one because the colors did get so murky. And I can remove paint that way. So my process is a matter of back and forth between adding paint, adding wax medium, scratching out. Sometimes I'll try scratching out with things like a plastic fork or whatever I can find around the studio, adding more, wiping off, so on and so forth. And as I mentioned earlier, the texture of the paper itself, or the hard surface, it works best on a hard surface. The surface that you work on, that texture becomes important, and you can manipulate that as well. So for example, in this one, you can see a lot of brush marks and a lot of places where the texture underneath the surface texture shows through. And what I did for this one is a piece of watercolor paper with gesso, which is a white acrylic primer, loosely brushed on so that the paint and wax go into the grooves. Just a couple more examples of different ways that the wax can look. Obviously scratching through, you can see removing, loosening up with a brush. And sometimes I try to remove so much that I get just sort of a gentle stain on the paper for light areas. Thanks for watching. If you have questions, let me know.
So thanks, Alex. That's really great. I think what I liked best about that is just to me, the tools that you use, saying that you use utensils and just that adaptability. And also, that you start with the drawing, but you're not tied to that. It doesn't have to be that initial concept.
Right. Yeah, and in particular in that demo, I realized I had a very small piece of paper to fit for the camera. So as soon as I started with the enormous tools, I realized, forget it. That drawing was way too small. But that also, I mean, that does happen where you start in one direction, and it's one of the things that makes painting so enjoyable. It kind of has a life of its own, and sometimes it just decides it's not going in the direction that you thought, and so you kind of go along for the ride and see where you end up.
Does anybody have any questions about the cold wax technique? You made it very approachable. I'm a little intimidated to try new things. I'm just kind of strictly an oil painter, but seeing that it looks really fun. So I might try it. Good.
It is fun. And it's forgiving as a medium. You can scrape it all off literally or rub it all off, and
right.
I like anything that's forgiving.
The staining of the paper was interesting too. Just that kind of ability to create layers and texture is always interesting.
I just want to add one more thing. There's something I read that's been on my mind a lot lately. It's something that the artist Henri Matisse said, that the older he got, the more he realized painting was about editing. And I think that's such a good comment. I think it's true of writing. It's probably true of any creative endeavor, that a lot of it is editing. And that's something that I haven't been very good at. I tend to just keep adding. So one thing in the Inscape series that I was very conscious of is trying to minimize and trying to edit, and how much removing paint is equal to putting paint on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting because, any kind of art form, it's also its own language. So kind of the more you know about your materials and the effects that they may produce, it kind of can help you, I don't know, just in your creative process. So although you don't know the exact outcome necessarily, like you kind of know what to expect, so you can, make stuff.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
I also posted it in the chat. If I think I might have missed the very beginning when we were kind of fiddling around with the sound. Alex, you said you use canvas paper. So is that like in lieu of doing this on a canvas, quote unquote?
Yes, and I tried different surfaces, a wood panel, a paper that you have a primer on, or a canvas paper works. And for me, that's better because I'm pressing so hard and scraping so much that if it's on a canvas, there's too much give in the fabric. The oil can be used on canvas, or I'm sorry, the wax medium can be used on canvas, certainly. But it just works better on a hard surface. So that's why I was using the canvas paper.
Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions right now for Alex?
I got a question for you, Alex, about the cold wax medium. I've used it with Gambar in the past, just a tiny little bit, and I don't know if this is my imagination or not. It looked like over time it became a little more matte and maybe a little beaded. Have you found any problems like that when you're working with cold wax over time?
I'm fairly new to working with it, but it definitely gets more matte. I've also tried, because I had read about people using it as a final varnish to protect a watercolor or a photograph. And I've tried doing that and then buffing it, like you let it dry a day or two, and then you can kind of buff it with a soft rag. It doesn't make it shiny by any means. I think it is really a matte medium. I have not come across beading. I can imagine that might happen just out of the nature of it. And in terms of longevity, these paintings are really very recent, so I have no idea. Yeah, time will tell. I've had this bottle of, or this jar of the wax sitting in my studio, and I'm trying to use materials that I already own because I love nothing more than buying new things. So I just kind of picked it up and thought, all right, I'm going to figure this out. So I'm a novice when it comes to that.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we're gonna move on to Vanessa. So let me start that. So the sound on this one might not be so great. So maybe Vanessa, would you mind maybe narrating this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Oops. Sorry, one sec. All right. Sorry. Computer. Okay. We'll see how bad it gets with the traffic. So,
There is a lot of experimentation. I think I need to fight. She starts with a blank canvas and old paint. And this old paint is all spontaneous. And then after the old paint dries, and I'm ready to start.
I think I might want to narrate. Emily, do you think I should narrate it? Because it's
go for it.
it sounds very
Darth Vader.
Darth Vader. So I guess maybe mute the audio and then I'll narrate as best as I can from what I
Sure.
remember.
It should be muted now, so
Oh, good. Okay.
you can relive this
Okay.
experience for us.
So, okay. I guess I'll start talking about the palette and the magazines and I guess my tools. Lately I've been working very simple. So I just started out with the 3 primary colors. I'm not sure if phthalo blue is necessarily a primary color, but I used it to make a grayish purple. And on the kind of upper left-hand corner in the middle, it's not really the corner in the middle, that's typically the canvas that I start out with is usually a blank canvas with some underpaint on it, and it's just old paint that smears on the brush and that I can no longer use on the canvas that I'm actually working on. So what I'll do is I'll just take turpentine and then I'll just smear it on a blank canvas, and I'll just keep smearing and smearing until usually it depends on whether I want to keep some white just to give it a layer. I've been trying to scale back on how much I add to the canvas so that there's more brightness and sort of, well, I guess I would say expansiveness to it. And then what I like to do is with that, the blank canvas is turn it around because there's drips and stuff. And I like the spontaneity of just watching where the drips go. And then I leave it. And that's usually the basis of my composition when I start with the landscapes that's kind of like the basic of where all the colors go. And then that kind of guides what I do. Of course, I do strive for balance when I work, when I start to finally work on the canvas. And now, do I need to push play on this, Emily? Because I don't see it moving.
Oh, it could have just stalled. It, internet can only do so many things at once. So
Okay. Well, then I'll just keep explaining more stuff on the, I guess I would say on my work area. So then I guess you can see the magazines, and that's typically where I cut out collage stuff. And like I was saying, lately, I've been gravitating towards shiny sort of objects. So I think you can see that those are De Beer diamonds, and there's like 3 little colored diamonds, and I usually just cut them out, and then I use the wet paint as a glue and just stick it straight on the wet paint. And I like sometimes when I stick it, like if I put a lot of paint on it and just gob it really just nice and juicy so that it's nice and sticky. And then when I stick the thing on there, the paint sort of smooshes out to the side. And then there's sort of an element of spontaneity, because sometimes I get lucky, and sometimes if I've mixed in a lot of colors but not mixed it in all the way, it'll kind of just sort of splotch out and it'll make it really interesting. Sometimes I'm not so lucky, and then I'll just add detail to it. But there is a lot of spontaneity in the work. So and let's see, I'm trying to think of what else I can say about how I start and stuff. But I generally use linseed oil and turpentine, and I kind of try to keep things very simple. So I just use the basic linseed oil. And sometimes, like, this is a more bare bones palette because I'm kind of away from my studio these days. I really don't have a regular studio where I practice. So that's why I kind of kept it to the primary colors. And I'm trying to think of what else I can say. I think still going. No, it's so that there's video of me painting. And again, like I would say that Emily described it best. It's spontaneous and intuitive, and I kind of, like Alex also said, it just sometimes there's a lot of happy surprises that I can follow up on.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like maybe you have kind of some existing canvases that are kind of your secondary canvas when you had been working on that primary painting. So it kind of carries over to the next piece. So are there like, is it purely random, purely abstract? Are there certain things that you are thinking about, like these shoes, I need to paint these, this triggers something for me?
Well, a lot of it is stuff that sort of catches my interest. When I first started this series, I was working at this really kind of intense, like as an executive assistant in this, high-end consulting firm, and it was very stressful. And so it really kind of got me thinking about corporate America. So when I would cut out like corporate logos. So in a lot of the works, there's the Lunestra butterfly, there's an AT&T globe. I think there's like a singular, I don't know if that even exists anymore, but just little corporate logos. And then I would stick them into the paint. And so it was kind of my way of maybe, I don't know, taking it back. I don't know if that's really a way to approach it, but that was my interest at the time. Now that I'm thankfully far removed from that, it's more about just things that I enjoy more. I mean, the truth is, for me, it's very much about pleasure. And I guess I could talk more about the the palette. Like, I mean, my favorite thing is mixing colors and just sort of seeing like what happens and when you mix colors, and then just even adding like a little dab of this and a dab of that, and then not mixing them all the way, but seeing kind of what the surprises happen when you take a brush and you stroke it like in different ways. And so that's what I start out with. But generally I work on, I would say there's a primary canvas that I'm working on, which you should be able to see at some point in this video if it never like moves. And then I'll usually have about 3 or 4 canvases, kind of like that one, where I'm just sort of splotching paint on it. And then once a canvas gets ready, when I feel like it's gotten to a point where it's time for me to work on that one, that's the one that I pick up and start working with.
So tell me a little bit about your palette. So we had kind of a bare bones palette at the gallery the other day.
Yeah.
What else might you include in your kind of standard palette, or does that change?
You know, it changes. I mean, a lot of times I have to say that like Prussian blue is one of my favorite colors. And it wasn't in, because like I said, I don't have access to my studio right now. So I got a bunch of new paints and it was phthalo blue. So I had to reacquaint myself with that color. And I find that it's a very, very dominant color. That's just, to put it mildly, it just takes over everything. But generally my palette is a little bit more, I use like, I use the, yeah, he is, kitty cat. I usually have usually the primary colors, and then sometimes I incorporate cerulean blue and then yellow ochre and then the burnt sienna. And those are just sort of to maybe mute down the colors a little bit so that they're just not so pinky, because I like to have a little bit. I mean, I know I love pastels. I really, really love pastels. But I do want to add like just a little bit of a darkness to them, if that makes any sense, so that they're just not, otherwise I feel like they become like just too colorful and too, maybe, I don't know if prosaic is the right word, but maybe just too much, like too, so that's kind of what I go for. So generally I'll have like about 5 or 6 colors. Oh, and then I also like, I do like phthalo green. I feel like that's a little bit easier to work with than the blue, but that one wasn't available to me, you know, when we were at Emily's gallery, so.
You should check out Payne's Gray, because it's kind of it's an earthy gray, but it mixes really well and kind of mutes down without losing the vibrancy of colors.
Ooh, I've never tried that one, so.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite colors. Okay, enough for me. Any questions from the audience? It looks like there's some chat. Am I going to show the artist's work? Sure, we can do that. So things are kind of just in the shop. I don't actually have like a gallery page on the website, but we can certainly kind of look at that, and maybe if there's a particular painting that you, that any of the artists would like to talk about too. So these are some of Vanessa's pieces. Let me share this. So, you know, looking at a website together online isn't the best experience. So apologies for that. So this is, it's 6 by 12, this piece. And so we can see some of those colors that Vanessa was talking about. So she has these kind of earthy tones, and then some acidic tones. So there's kind of a interesting conflict between those colors, some interesting chemistry. Is there a piece here, Vanessa, that you might want to?
Oh, Daybreak.
Daybreak.
So Daybreak, yeah, that's that one. What was interesting about that one is that started out, I had thought about maybe going a little bit like, you know, adding some architectural elements in it. And that's kind of how it started out. But then I don't know, it's sort of like, again, the process takes over, and in this one, what I was interested in was just sort of how the brush stroke, just how if I used a much bigger brush for a lot of the brush strokes, and then I kind of went horizontal, like up and just straight, and some of it was the colors I just applied, like a lot of it was painted wet on wet, and then I just applied the colors and to see sort of how they would merge with each other. And then at the bottom, I didn't really, I kind of wanted to see what different textures were. This one was still sort of experimental in the sense I think this might have been one of the ones where I started to use dried oil paint that had sort of half dried on my palette. And then I would take my palette knife and just sort of like scissor it off the palette and then just stick it onto so like on the bottom left-hand corner, there was a lot of like, just sort of dried paint that I would stick on there. And I was playing a lot with that one. And then I also had these Japanese papers. And so you can't really see it too well, but I thought that could be sort of like a foliage. And it kind of, that's sort of how it emerged for me, like a foliage and then maybe like a cityscape in the background, but it's very muted, because then what I did when I decided that I didn't really want to take the cityscape theme, I just added sort of scumbled up some like white, like very light yellow and white over on it. And then there was also, at that time I was getting a lot of Wisconsin cheesemen, like a lot of catalogs, and I really wanted to stop the catalogs, but I couldn't. So I ended up cutting out a lot of like candy and like strawberries and just the things they were selling and putting them on there. But so, and then with this one, there was also I figured out that if you make the linseed oil runny enough, that can drip, and then that's where some of the drips come from with this one. So, but this one, I believe, I want to say this is where I started using the dried paint on that one.
Would this be sort of the beginning of your vertical paintings too, or had you been doing that before?
No, I had been doing that before. I had kind of wanted to work vertically because I don't know, I think maybe it had something to do with, I mean, this is what I think it is now. To be honest, at the time, I didn't really think of it that way, but just looking outside, like the office window and everything just seemed vertical, like because I worked downtown at that time. And so all the buildings were tall and vertical. And I'm wondering if that's what influenced me, because I really felt called to work in a vertical format.
Anybody have some questions for Vanessa about her work? If you don't want to talk, you can always put your question in chat and I will do you the honor of reading your question. Oh, okay.
I have a question for Vanessa.
Hi, Carolyn.
Running late. Hey Vanessa, are you gonna paint again, or what's your next step? Because you're such a fucking, sorry I swore, awesome painter. You're so, I mean, I just enjoy these. These are great.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I plan to paint again and I've started. So.
Oh, and are you going?
Well, right now I'm working with I'm working with gouaches, and actually I'm working on a new series of work that's more scaled back because I don't have the studio space. It's just my home studio, and it's live paintings of sushi, which I know some of you have seen, but I haven't quite put it. I have posted some of it maybe on a blog, but that was when I started some other ones earlier, and I've got newer ones that I still have to take pictures of.
Cool. Well, I love this show. It's great how all the colors feed into each other. It was really well hung at the art, at the gallery, and your ladies, everybody looks great. Thanks, guys.
Well, thank you.
Sign off now. And last thing I will say, Vanessa, I think it would be great for you to explore or talk more about like the pursuit of pleasure in the paintings, because I know the sushi is such a huge, you're celebrating, or I'm sure there's a lot of elements to that, no?
Yeah. Oh no, I mean, it's all about pleasure. That's the truth. I won't lie. Like I mean, I love, like, I think when I paint, I gravitate towards like things that make me happy, I guess. And it does make me very happy to work with colors and use bright ones. And so that's part of it. And just even the whole pleasure of all of it. Like even looking through the magazines is pleasurable, and looking at like everything that they're trying to show and saying like, well, maybe I would want that, but I really wouldn't, or, but just imagining myself have it or so. So those are kind of what the thoughts that go through my mind when I work on this work.
So then it's kind of like pleasure and desire or something, you know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
yeah, so that's
Terrible voice.
Oh.
all right. Listen, I'm gonna mute and thanks guys. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Yeah, pleasure is sort of an interesting concept. I feel like it's like pleasure with a purpose though, because I dislike the idea of any kind of satisfaction that we get from making art being turned into the, well, you love making art, so that is your payment for doing it. So I think it's like a satisfaction for an essential part of yourself versus like a superficial pleasure, or how we think of pleasure in a material sense. So I just
Well,
wanted
we talked about this, and I think that is a fallacy that a lot of people think like, oh, well, it's all like joyful and fun and wonderful while you're doing it. And to be honest, it's not all the time. Sometimes it can get downright like, oh, I want to kill this canvas, or just, I mean, it can be very frustrating, or sometimes you feel like and I have had many paintings that I dare not show because they just didn't work for whatever reason. And even after months of turning them over and like not looking at them, and having the back of the canvas face outward and they face the wall, but sometimes they just don't work, and then that can be, I would say, less than pleasurable for sure. So
How about Alex and Claire? Do you have any opinions about that topic? So like, what do you do when work just isn't working for you? And like, what is the ratio of like studio frustration to, oh yes, this is going exactly how it should be going?
I had, when I was in high school, I had a art teacher who said that for every 10 paintings you do, one will be good. And I've sort of held on to that ever since, which is that like, even if I am like having a way better painting average than that, I can hold on to that when I have a painting that's driving me crazy. There's a painting driving me crazy right over my shoulder right now, actually. It's really hard to look at. Sometimes it's just like one little thing, and then sometimes there are pieces that I put away for weeks or months or even like years, and sometimes I come back to it and save it, and sometimes I come back to it and just completely paint over it and do something entirely different.
And that destruction is part of the creative process too, being able to say, this doesn't work and I'm not attached to it and I'm going to paint over it or throw it away or whatever is important.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Claire said, and to add on to that, it was actually my husband who helped me see that by using a baseball metaphor. And I don't know baseball, so I may get this wrong, but I was really frustrated with how many paintings don't work out. And he talked about a batter's average, like a 300 is evidently a good average, which means out of 10 times up to bat, there are 3 hits. So I tried telling myself that, okay, my average can be good if I get 1 or 2 out of a batch. And it's hard because you become so attached to each painting and you want so desperately for it to work out. And sometimes that's the kiss of death, is I'll just keep pushing at something and it just won't get where it's supposed to go. And if I put it away, or sometimes I've torn up work and then used parts of it or painted over, I mean, all those things that I think every artist does.
Mm-hmm. I think that's like problem solving and adaptability. I think that's a really key component to, if you want to, I mean, it's nice when art is fun, but it's getting through the parts that are not so fun. I think that it will determine whether or not you can sustain your studio practice past your youth. So
Well, and Emily, you were just talking about the sort of like creative act of destroying the work, and I always also think about the Chekhov quote about killing your darlings, and I find that with a lot of times with paintings, similar to what you were just saying, Alexandra, like you'll have a painting and there's parts of it you love so much, you want to preserve those, but it's the other parts you can't get to work. And you realize once you get rid of the part that you love so much, then you make the painting work. And it's like holding on to the sort of like precious elements of the painting is actually making the whole thing sort of go stagnant.
Mhm. Good point. So I'm gonna, oh, is there another question?
Yeah, so I was, when I had asked about showing the artist's work, I was wondering if you were going to go through, you had a slideshow last time that just quickly went through their work, because I think there's a lot of people on here that didn't get to see that.
I did, but you know, I had a plugin conflict and I had to deactivate that slideshow thing. Sorry about that, but you know what? I'll do it. I'll add it to the site after this and I'll send a link to everybody. And let me just put this link in there right now anyway. So this also has the videos that we've watched are on here, and all the work can be seen currently in the shop, and I promise I'll make a gallery for you too.
Thank you.
So let's watch Claire's video now. Let me.
I work in a converted garage.
Oops. Sorry.
Come to my studio. I work in a converted garage. We put in a door, skylights, white walls. I share it with some strollers, lots of spiders, and occasionally a cute baby or two. A lot of it is painting storage. Here, 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 and here.
Can everybody see the video?
This is my
or
workspace.
No. Okay,
My easel.
let me try that again. Sorry. Okay.
Welcome to my studio. I work in a converted garage. We put in a door, skylights, and white walls. I share it with some strollers, lots of spiders, and occasionally a cute baby or two. A lot of it is painting storage. Here, 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 and here. This is my workspace. My easel, palette, paints, some brushes. This is what I'm working on right now. This too. This wall has the best light, so it's where I photograph my work. I always keep photos and paintings up for inspiration. I'm Claire Elliott, and this is a look inside my painting process. Starting off with mixing some colors. I've got 3 little piles of Winsor Newton soft mixing white, a little bit of yellow ochre that I'm smoothing out down in the corner there. All of these are already laid out on my larger glass palette. I've created a little mixing area in the center of the palette where I'm working here. I'm mixing up colors for the flowers of the plant that I'm painting. So they'll all be within the same color family. I just added a little bit of Holbein Radiant Lemon, and there's the Holbein Radiant Pink. And mixing that up with the white. So half of that goes off to the side, and the other half I use as the base for the next color. And I sort of continue that way as I mix more colors, always using a previous color as a sort of bridge to the next one. I use that both to create multiple values of one hue, as well as just to sort of create harmony between the different colors on the palette. As I go along, I start pulling in other colors from elsewhere on the palette. So at this point, a little bit of olive green coming in there. So this little array of colors is what I'll start from for the piece I'm working on. And then I will certainly end up adding color, both mixing on the canvas and as I go. There's a little behind the scenes of cleaning off the palette, scraping the paint away first with a palette knife and then with my paint scraper. It's just a big plain piece of glass backed by some foam core. So this is about the third or fourth session working on this particular painting. I started with a bright neon ground and then worked up the painting. And now I'm working in these layers of darker color that I'm sort of washing over. I work pretty quickly with these, but I work in sort of short bursts because, as you can see, the multiple layers and then subsequent wiping off of the paint requires some downtime between each working session. The process here is pretty similar to the versions of these wildflower and weed paintings that I've done on paper. On oil and canvas, it just tends to take a bit longer and require more sessions and more layers. Here I am in some of those colors you saw me mixing earlier for the flowers. This is hairy bittercress that I'm painting. And you can see on the right-hand side of the painting, the wash that I had laid down earlier is starting to drip down, which is exactly what I want to happen in this painting.
So I loved watching you mix your colors, like so scientific. It was great to watch. And it's like exactly what I know I should do and I don't do. But it was really fun to watch that. So thank you.
Thanks. I always feel like I'm a very unscientific color mixer. I know artists who are like so much better at color theory, but that's just sort of my, I don't know, that's my way of mixing up as much color as I can at once.
Mm-hmm.
But then, you know, I do that and then I still end up mixing like a ton of stuff on the canvas and then a ton of stuff with my brush, which, you know, I'm not supposed to do. But.
Well, I mean, there are no rules, or rules are made to be broken. Whatever works is the right way.
True.
I think. How about, does anyone have any questions for Claire? You can ask in chat if you're shy.
Well, I have a question about your background, Claire, for the single plant paintings. They remind me of like when I look at the context of the other work that's in the gallery, it's almost as if they're hidden. And so it makes me feel like it's like they're sort of struggling against like something that's coming down on them, because at least with the yellow avens, for instance, like I believe that's the one that has like a very gloomy background, and it's almost as if it's sort of coming down, but then you see the plant emerging up and there's an inner light to it. And I was wondering if you could talk about that more, because I wasn't sure if that was an allusion to maybe, since these are all weeds, they're, you know, humans usually try to eliminate them, and if that was maybe part of your thought process with that.
Yeah, that is sort of how I've been thinking about these. I think about them a couple ways. One is this sort of like almost sort of using the sort of like language of religious art that way of like sort of spotlighting the central object and having this like glow from the backgrounds that I was using. So with a lot of them, I'm starting with like fluorescent, like just like a fluorescent ground and then building up on top of it. So I get that kind of glow. And then the other thing I was thinking about them, because they're weeds, is the idea of elevating them, but also kind of memorializing them. And the ones that I've been working on most recently are ones that are sort of like the required eradication weeds. The ones that like here in Portland, like the like Portland Parks and Recreation, like, you know, has signs about like, get rid of it, you know, if you see this plant, pull it out kind of stuff, because it'll take over and make it really hard for other things to grow and disrupt the ecosystem. And so this idea of like, when I'm gardening, I feel terrible pulling out a plant, even when I know it's a plant that is going to harm the other plants that I've put in. So this idea of like giving myself permission to do that by painting these, like sort of creating this sort of memorial to them.
Oh, that's really interesting, because it definitely comes across, because I was looking at them and thinking, gosh, these are weeds, but they've got this inner spirit, but then there's kind of like almost like maybe a chemical rain. That's interesting what you said about Portland, that it sounds like the city is urging the public, pull out these weeds, like help us, you know, you have permission to eradicate them. So it's like a full scale sort of onslaught. And that's the feeling I get from when I look at the backgrounds of those works.
Yeah, I was also looking for that sort of like toxic feel for some of the fluorescents for them too, especially the green ones.
Yeah. Claire, what is Yupo paper?
Yupo paper is sort of a plastic paper. It's Japanese, and everything will sit right on the surface of it because it is plastic. So you can wipe off if you're using, like if I'm using oil, stuff will just slide right off of it and wipe off. The pieces in the show are acrylic gouache, which wipes off to a degree, but will still leave a stain. But it gives me, so I started doing those pieces when I was taking a break from oil painting. And I felt that the surface was the closest I could get to the type of surface that I use when I'm painting in oil.
So is it a firm paper as opposed to something that's very bendable? Or
no, it's very bendable. It's like super pliable. I probably have a piece right here. You can see it. And it's got like, yeah, this nice sort of super smooth surface. You can get it opaque and translucent. You can always get it from Blick, but lots of other places.
Does it fold easily?
It folds all right. It does it like, you can't like, you can fold it. It gets like a little awkward and brittle and doesn't like doesn't have a nice clean seam. Especially the heavier weight of it. And if you're doing watercolors with it, you have to be really careful not to touch the surface with your fingertips, because the oil on your fingertips will stick to the paper, and then the watercolor you can't get to stick to the paper.
I didn't know that. I've experienced that, and now I know what it was.
I've learned it the hard way. Yeah.
You could probably do some interesting stuff with that.
You definitely could do some interesting resist work with that. And otherwise you can just sort of like buff it a little bit, and usually you should be able to buff and then like wash, and you know, should be able to paint on top then.
Have you ever done any large scale Yupo paintings, or would you? Like the ones that I've seen so far.
Sorry, can you say that again? You broke up for a sec.
I just wondered if you would ever do like a large scale Yupo painting.
So the biggest size that's you can get that isn't on a roll, 20 by 26. I've done a few 20 by 26 ones of the weeds paintings. The issue I've had with it is the way that I've been working with that paper and with those pieces is that they're very drippy, and especially with the acrylic gouache. And so I found it really difficult to scale up. I didn't like the size of the drip. You know, you can't like change how big a drip is. And so like you can't scale that up. I just didn't love the way it worked, and you have to work so quickly with the acrylic wash, that I found it very challenging, and also really challenging to like control where the washes were going.
Right.
But I've definitely used it with oil, especially to sort of like sketch out ideas. I do that a lot.
Mhm.
But 20 by 26 is about as big as I've gone. I know you can buy rolls of it, but I don't think you can get the roll. Like, I don't think you can get the height bigger than 26, would be my guess.
So you mentioned that also that you stopped oil painting for a little while. Was there a reason that you stopped?
I stopped because I was pregnant. So around last year. And so I was working on paper, probably from like February of last year through, I started again at the end of my pregnancy painting in oil. So like through the summer.
Did that
and
change changing your materials like that? Did that change your approach or your subject matter?
Yeah, it changed a lot. I think this was my second pregnancy, and the first time I had done it, I just didn't like any of the work I made on paper. I just was finding it really hard to translate the work that I did in oil to paper. And this time, I sort of thought like, all right, let me just focus on these materials and not think about like the larger bodies of work that I'm interested in right now. And so I focused on, I was making the window paintings. I see one in your background right there, and found that really helpful. And then I was just sort of like trying to get inspired by the stuff around me and started thinking about weeds, and decided to sort of really scale it down and to just be working on the individual plants. And that's carried over back into my oil painting practice now. And so now I've been making these on canvas in oil instead of on paper, and finding sort of like new things that I have to shift about the ways that I make the work, but really excited about where they're going.
I wondered too, so sort of historically, traditionally, women artists tend to have less studio space or work smaller just due to their other responsibilities. And I wondered too, if you're interested in like weedy small plants and these kind of portraits, small intimate portraits, also related to any thoughts you might have about being a woman artist or domestic roles.
Yeah, I think in terms of the weeds sort of like as this, they have this sort of fertility metaphor to them, but a negative fertility metaphor a lot of the time, especially like think about dandelions a lot of like people hate that the weeds are like getting all over the place and reproducing. And so certainly thinking about like the relationship of sort of natural bounty to femininity and motherhood in particular for me. And in terms of size, I've always liked painting small. It's my preferred scale. I've at times done larger pieces and I enjoy it, and I've like my smallest size has scaled up quite a bit from what it used to be. I mean, I used to paint like 4x4 really little. I loved holding the like painting in my hand when I was working. And I think part of that is space constraints. So I don't know how related it is to gender. I mean, it was more just I was like painting out of my bedroom for years, and I'm in a larger space now, and I'm painting some bigger work, but I do kind of, yeah, I keep it a bit smaller. Overall, it is more manageable. I guess one relationship would be to time, which is just that,
right?
I find it hard to work on a really big piece in little tiny spurts, and I'd rather finish something or just be able to address the entire canvas in sort of the shorter working sessions that I have available to me right now.
Yeah, I agree. It's frustrating to lose momentum and to lose the thread of what you start on a large piece. So yeah, I wonder, Vanessa or Alex, do you guys have any thoughts about, or I mean, maybe I shouldn't talk about being a woman artist because we're just artists after all, it doesn't really matter. But I just read that article about Helen Frankenthaler in the New York Times, which was kind of interesting, about her career and maybe not getting like all of the respect she deserved during her lifetime, or what at the height of those painters because of her relationships with male artists?
I'm fascinated to read the new Helen Frankenthaler biography that's out now too. I don't know if you've read 9th Street Women, that was out maybe a couple years ago. It was fascinating. It's about Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, Grace Hartigan, Elaine de Kooning, and I'm forgetting the 5th one, which is terrible, but 5.
Lee Krasner.
Thank you, Lee Krasner, right. 5 abstract expressionists, and it's about New York, it's about the art world, and they're integral to everything. And yet, of course, as we know, we hear the names Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning and so forth. But yeah, I guess reading that book, and I love reading biographies of women artists in particular, because just how intrepid and just all the things that they sort of work against in order to keep pursuing their art. Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, I think, is also the classic text on needing time and space for any creative endeavor. So I would recommend those for anybody who's interested in thinking of that further.
Definitely.
Yeah, and touching on that, it's interesting because I really prefer having a studio away from my house. And I feel like as a woman, even if like your partner is into equality or will help out, it still seems to fall on you, or it seems for me. I mean, I don't know, maybe with male partners, it seems that it ends up falling on, at least for me, this has been my experience. I'm only going to speak from my experience, that it's like the house becomes my responsibility. And so like having a studio in the house makes it harder to maintain the house. And it's interesting, like when I have my studio, I feel like a freedom, just like in Virginia Woolf's Room of One Own. You just have that time and space that's away from all other responsibilities to create. And so that's been one of the things that I know I need to get back to, is finding a studio that's away from my house, because it's really impacted my practice a lot, like not having that. And I think it's critical. I mean, I don't know if that's true for every, artist who's a woman or who has these responsibilities, but I know that for me, it was, I need that space and time. So I think it's very important.
I think it's true for anyone who wants to be an artist. It's just like taking yourself seriously enough to invest in making that time and space for yourself.
Yeah.
Any other artists in the audience who had a thought about that? Time and space. No.
I have a comment and a question for everybody. Speaking of time and space, I'm a painter, and the biggest struggle is working a job and finding time to paint on top of the job, trying to make time before going to work and after going to work, on the weekends, and not doing certain social things that you want to do. It's really tough. And I know everybody gets that. My question is, how do any of you deal with social media? I don't understand how anyone can make time for social media. And I don't want to do it.
You don't have to do it.
I have to do it, but I don't want to do it.
It can be a necessary evil. It just depends what your goals are. What are you trying to do with social media? Don't feel obligated to do it just because everybody else is doing it, because it is a real time suck. Is there like something in particular that you feel compelled? Do you feel like you're missing out on?
Just driving people to my website, really. I know it's not getting many views, and that's where I'd like people to look, but how do you do that? And I know the social media is really great at that, but that also takes away from the hour or two that I can paint, struggle to paint each day, if I can even do that.
I think
if I can put my two cents,
please.
I think I'm still painting largely thanks to social media. If it wasn't around, I think I would have quit 5 years ago, because there are no galleries in this world that want to represent me, and the ones that did, I hated their guts, and I love the fact that I can reach out directly to people all over the globe. And it's just done amazing things for me, and that's only going to get better. And I wish all this stuff had been in existence 20 years ago when we just finished art school. If it was as evolved as it is right now, I would have not had all that frustration and having to deal with all these weird people, you know, and it's just, it's a great thing, and it's not that difficult, and you don't have to spend hours on it. Then you can do it between other things.
It can become distracting though. You know, it's
I
just,
think if you take it in your stride, it just adds to the process. So, you know, it's just, it's like how you, it's how you approach it, really. I think if you take it in your stride, it actually helps you with your work rather than takes away from, you know, rather than retracting from it.
Right, it definitely can be a tool, but I do think that, you know, if you chafe against it, if it doesn't work for you, then it's not worth investing your energy into it. I think Instagram can be helpful to artists because there are just a lot of galleries, other artists, curators that are on Instagram and looking for certain things. But if it doesn't work for you, that's okay. And maybe if, you know, if you feel like it's important to your career, you could always look at hiring like an intern from a college and have them do it.
I did have a question for Leo because I'm struggling with social media as well, and Laura and I have talked about this, and I guess the question is, I feel like it could be very helpful because I can see the what I would say the benefits, but then there's also the distraction. It's like, how do you set boundaries around it? Because I feel like that's the hardest thing. It's almost like you fall down a rabbit hole, and like that's what I find is that I'll post something and then I'll get in a back and forth with someone, or not even a back and forth. It could even be just something friendly, like it could be someone I haven't seen in like 10 years, but then I find that 45 minutes or an hour has gone, and it's like, uh-oh, like now I need to go like do something else, or now I need to meet, you know, or I mean, that's, so I guess I'm curious about how you navigate that, because I feel like it could be a big distraction, and that's what I'm struggling with.
I don't have any like clear sort of borders to me. You know, I haven't really set any kind of limits for myself. It's just that I mean, if I notice something like this, like what you just mentioned, that I'm like on it just, you know, too long, I'm doing too many things, and I'll just finish the task that I was doing, and I'll just end it at that and go do something else, and then I'll get back to it later in the day or in the evening when I'm not, you know, when I'm not painting or not doing anything creative, and you know, spend maybe 15-20 minutes. Not, I mean, I've hardly ever been like on it for hours. And if somebody's really, you know, if I'm busy doing something and a friend is messaging, I'll just leave it until later, you know.
So with that leaving, it would be not responding. I mean, because maybe that's what I need to do.
Yeah, either not responding or telling them that I'll write them later, you know. Depends on how close the friend is and how, you know. So I don't know. I mean, it's kind of nice now because due to the pandemic, I hadn't had a lot of work, so I have a bit more time to actually devote to this stuff. And as far as there are some, I don't want to do any, like, I don't want to go off topic, so I don't want to get into this, but there are some podcasts and stuff around that help you navigate through this whole system, you know. So if you look around, you will find them. And of course, these are like marketing people who are trying to sell you something, so you don't have to buy their stuff. You can just glean the good bit and skip the rigmarole.
I think it just comes down to what are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to accomplish through social media? So if it's driving traffic to your website, so what kind of traffic? Who is that audience that you're trying to attract? What other ways might you contact them?
I think it's also, I don't think it has changed that much, frankly, when you think about the 1950s art scene in New York and the Beat generation. And, you know, the contrast is between doing the work you need to do, which is very solitary. And if you're doing it in a disciplined way, you are doing it alone. And then you have a crave, you need other people because you're a human being. And so the scene in New York, which I happen to have read a lot about, was people gathering in bars and coffee houses and hanging out all night long. And if you do too much of that, there's nothing left of yourself. If you talk too much about your own project, you kind of talked it out, you haven't saved it for your own personal, very creative, solitary experience. And it's like the social without the media. So yeah, that's how I think of it. It's like discipline, self-discipline. It's the same that it was before.
Yeah, that's a great.
That is a great.
I think that's
point.
a danger.
Yeah.
And I definitely find sometimes, and I know other artists talk about this, when you do have sort of like an active Instagram, making work for the Instagram instead of making your work, that's a really easy trap. And I definitely find myself sometimes like at the end of a painting session being like, oh no, but I don't have anything to post a picture of today. And like that should never, you should never go down that sort of hole. There's a bunch of different resources in terms of like setting up a social media sort of platform for yourself. Kate Moths, who runs Young Space, which is a digital gallery, has an artist guide to social media. It's not free, but it's like $10 or $15 that I found very helpful in terms of setting limits for yourself. And I think like those limits can be almost like freeing or aspirational if you don't want to really be doing too much of it, but also like really helpful restriction reminders if you do too much of it. But I find for myself, like I try when I'm in the studio to just be in the studio, and then like if I'm gonna post something, do it at the end of the session so I'm not looking at my phone a bunch. And then also I will like pick a day every week or 2 weeks and shoot work or like studio shots and then post them over time. And that way I'm not thinking every day of a thing that I, need to share, and because like that's how you get the best engagement is like sort of consistent stuff. It's like consistent posting sort of daily and stuff. It's, I don't know. It's good and bad, but like it's what connected me to Emily and to this show. So for me, it's worked out pretty well.
There's one other question in chat here, and then we'll finish. Ramon asks, do any of us feel that pandemic stress has hampered or promoted our creativity or approach toward organizing our craft?
I would say for the very reasons we've been talking about, time and space, that the pandemic actually helped me, because the studio, last March was socially isolated. It was like the place outside the home I could go. And even at that point, I was working full time. Right now I'm not, but at that point I had a very long commute. I spent about 3 hours of my day commuting. So that was taken out. And I retired from a teaching position in June. And I think had it not been for COVID, knowing myself, because teaching is just, you're just constantly going and doing things, I think I would have jumped right into other things, volunteering, or, I felt this urge, like I had to be doing stuff. I was so used to being trained by bells ringing and due dates. But with COVID, I went to the studio every day, and that was a godsend. I certainly don't want to say, I hate to say good things came out of COVID, but for me personally, it did provide a time, a place, and an excuse. I didn't feel guilty. There were no social things to turn down. It was wonderful. I'm thinking actually now, once things start opening back up again, I don't know if I know how to be social or how to engage with people, but it was really a gift of the time and space needed, and being able to work without feeling obligated to be doing something else, because of course working in my studio is what I want to do, and it's so easy for obligations to get in the way. So that was my personal experience.
Claire or Vanessa, did you any?
Well, I would second that. Unfortunately, I still felt like there was a lot of stress for me about maybe I shouldn't have allowed it to infect me, but it really did, like just the stress of thinking about all the people out of work, and I would drive around and I would see no one and nothing, like no stores open. And then I would get sick to my stomach. So unfortunately, it like, I mean, when I look back, I wish I was able to be more productive like Alex and use it to either find a studio space or like find or just, you know, find the extra space to work. But I won't lie, I spent a lot of time, like quite a, you know, and especially in the early days, I spent probably hours on my couch just curled up in a fetal position going, oh my God, is the world ending? Like it was really pretty bad, I won't lie. And so it's kind of unfortunate, but I will say in some ways I kind of tried to look at the good things. I actually made a list of like 10 good things that came out of the pandemic just to kind of try to jumpstart myself. And then I will say that in some ways, I think it did end up being good for me, not really maybe creatively, but more like in terms of looking for other sources of income, because I was working at a yoga studio before the pandemic hit. And obviously that was shut down. And then I had to scramble for other income, and I somehow managed to get a job editing editing a self-help book. And so now I'm starting to realize that, well, okay, this is something, another way I could branch out. So in that way it was good. But I will say that it's interesting how like the extra time that I had, unfortunately, the anxiety was very difficult to manage in the beginning. And like, I mean, I finally feel like I've come through it, but I don't know how other people felt, but that's how it was for me. So.
Yeah, I think I had sort of a combination of those those two experiences, which was at the beginning, I really felt like I was having this sort of like extra time in the studio because there was nothing else to do. And in particular, I was just like taking care of my daughter, and we couldn't really go anywhere. You like can't go to the children's museum, can't go to the, you know, can't go anywhere. So like I was able to use my spare time during the days in the studio, which was great. But I was also, I did feel like a little bit of stress to try and somehow make work about the pandemic in the beginning. And some of the things I ended up making turned out well, though I don't know why I felt I needed to do that. But I did make these window paintings, I think like a couple of which are in the show, about the sort of like inside, outside, looking outside experience of the early pandemic, especially when we knew so little and everyone was sort of staying inside for safety, even though it would have been fine to go for a walk. And sort of like considering that now a year later, but I think the earlier part of the pandemic, I was like, had sort of like a lot of fruitful creativity. And then, you know, I had a baby at the end of September and suddenly had just exponentially less free time to spend in the studio, and have found it a much more frustrating creative experience since in that time, because no childcare and not getting like sort of out and getting inspiration as much, and that's been really hard.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are at 4:15 now, so this will conclude our second artist talk. If there are no more questions, you know, we can spend a little more time if there are more questions. We have the show will be up for one more week at the gallery. It's 5036 North Lincoln Ave in Chicago. You can also go to our website, eatpaintstudio.com, and I will put up a gallery of the work too. And also, everyone who came here today is going to get an email from Eventbrite with a link to download the digital version of the exhibit catalog. So that's going to be a PDF and also a Kindle and iBooks digital file. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Claire, Alex, Vanessa, for being part of the show. It's a great show, and it's been a pleasure to work with all of you.
Well, thank you, Emily. You've been great at everything you've organized and done for us. So from the artist perspective, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Emily.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this has been wonderfully put together. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend, and see you at the next show.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.